Now, the ANC Election Manifesto launch is our top story of the day. Here to help us unpack what the document details is political analyst Kagiso Pooe. Thank you so much for joining us this evening on Newsnight.
Thanks for having me.
Now, one may say that it's a speech that perhaps was more presidential as opposed to being President of the Republic of South Africa as opposed to President of the African National Congress. What is your view on the manifesto?
Oh, well, I think I'll take it two ways. I actually read the actual manifesto and I listened to the speech. I'd say the speech is better than what's actually in the paper. Hence, I think he knows how to put a good presentation on. But I also compared it to the 2014 manifesto election, and I know the big thing has been that they're focusing on the economy. The previous manifesto also focused on the economy. So for me, there's that lack of continuity to say, look, this is what we have done, this is where we went wrong, this is where we need to fix it. And I think probably the most glaring omission for me is to actually look at the organization wholeheartedly, because I think he gave probably a line or two about, look, we've made mistakes. Now, your mistakes as a party have literally cost the economy how much, and it cost people's lives. So from that point, I think speech is better than the actual thing. But as I think the key thing that did come out, which we really, really see in most political parties, is the focus on gender, to actually say, listen, it's abnormal in a society to actually treat women in a way that they're inferior. That was quite good, I have to say.
And also the standing up and on asking the men within the stadium themselves itself to stand up and take a pledge, almost to say that they will be against, or they will fight gender-based violence.
It's almost as I compare it to going to church and people saying, I give my life. And then the
salvation prayer. The
salvation prayer. Then the next day, because what's really important is the next day. Because it's one thing to ask people to stand up. It's another thing to say, listen, what do you get into the heart of a human being to say, listen, how do you practice this day in and day out? And I think it's an issue where it's good, but for me, pledges go very weak when you don't have follow through, when you can't say, listen, let's say, just a fictitious example, a man stood up yesterday, today goes home, he beats his wife with his girlfriend. What do you do the next day? So I think it's one of those things where I think South Africans, and especially women, are a bit tired of 16 days of activism, a bit tired of the show. They want to actually be seen, listen, this is what's happening, have the police change. Are you actually sensitive enough to understand that this is an abnormal situation?
But he did mention quite a few, and he touched on a lot when it comes to police, as well as some of the repercussions for any form of criminal activity. And I know that he spoke strongly against certain criminal activity should not even be allowed to even have bail. So speeches such as this and rhetoric such as this say that perhaps there's certain aspects that he wants to touch on, particularly when it comes to this for 4 or 5 years, provided that obviously the African National Congress wins the election.
Yes, and I think that's where maybe the irritation for some people might be that, listen, we've done this song and dance for the last 20 years or so. The key thing needs to be, let's just, if it was my wish, let's just rather have the election tomorrow, and whoever comes in, let's actually see what they're going to do. Because it's one thing, South African parties are great at giving rhetoric. They can give you the speech that saves lives, but the key thing which people want to be able to see is implementation. And that's where, even if you read the document, it's very weak on it to say, listen, it's one thing that the issue of the police and how police have treated the issue of gender-based violence has actually been in research for the longest time, from the closing of certain units within the police. Now, the key thing is, you've said that, but how do you go now to your Ministry of Justice to say, listen, reverse that and what you're putting in place? So it's more, I think we need to get away from the razzmatazz and actually say, listen, this is what you've done for the last 5 years. Give us an actual plan for the next 4 or 5 months how this is going to change. And
of course, I mean, sharing his views in terms of us having that non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council, and obviously looking at the Western Sahara. Do you think that those global issues, which of course are quite pertinent, was it the right time to be articulating views on some may say that it's more of a government kind of based approach as opposed to focusing on what people wanted to know, which is, are we going to focus on jobs this year? Is there going to be a focus on policing? Are we going to be safe? How do we build our country? How do we make sure that, or how does the ANC see building the country? And obviously the big one is land.
Yes, to the ANC's credit, the one thing they've always been consistent in is the focus on an international perspective on issues. The Western Sahara is for the last 20 years has always been in the ANC speech. So I think you also have to remember the people that were invited there are also people the ANC considers as friends. So we have to give them credit that they've been consistent in it. But I think it's still a bit murky in terms of, I don't quite think they understand how the dynamics have changed. I mean, the introduction of Trump and what that means for how you start to look more insular in terms of your nation. And I think, as you're saying, that's what people are saying, and that's an international trend. The fact that China, the economy is slowing down, China happens to be one of our biggest trading partners. How's that going to impact South Africa? And also the role of China on the continent for business. So I think that needed to be said more, but you're right in saying it should be something a president does, and it should be something which the party kind of puts as it's almost like seminars rather than putting it out to the mass public.
And I mean, because the mass public and just gauging from the support, one would, when the former president Jacob Zuma walked in and there was a huge cheer, it was a loud cheer, and of course Cyril Ramaphosa received his applaud, but more people were looking at President Jacob Zuma, so to say. And would you say that that is part of the populist election or the populism that they're trying to get rid of within the African National Congress itself?
It's an issue of saying, look, the man was at home. A king is always welcome in his home. And whether people like it or not, JZ is a very popular person in KZN. But the key thing is, would this have happened if it was another province? So I think it was just how they needed to manage that in such a way that, look, it's very big in that province that it's seen as though you respect your elders type of scenario.
And the ANC, African National Congress, one would say that it's particularly a stronghold within KZN in itself. So very strategic. Would you say that the objective was received or achieved really and looking at the upcoming election in May? That of course they managed to gather that united front and gather their support bases, so to say, and maybe not show so much factionalism as opposed to a united African National Congress going into the 2019 elections.
I think it was achieved because there were no boos. We're not speaking about boos. We're not speaking about people who were outed. So if that was the key thing to show the optics of it, it was done quite well. Excluding
the SACP as well as COSATU, they with their speeches and of course their standpoints around giving President Cyril Ramaphosa a chance.
Okay, this might be controversial. I always find it odd. Why are they there? Because let's be very honest, did anyone actually pay attention to what they're saying? Because it's an ANC manifesto, and the key thing would be, did they agitate enough for their own programs within the ANC manifesto? Because that's where their power is supposed to be seen. Just to hear them speaking about rhetoric, to be honest, I don't think most people are actually focusing on them.
Okay, so when we're looking at the manifesto in itself, I mean, we've touched on various issues, and I want us to draw specific focus on when it comes to jobs. And we had that presidential summit, right, on jobs, and he did touch again on it during his speech as well. The implementation of such strategies, that is where the African National Congress seems to fail, as you've rightly articulated. How do you see this then unfolding? Because this is going to be quite critical in order for them to win an election. They have to show that they can actually do something with the South Africa they've been given.
I'll put it in this way. One of my key focus areas when researching is actually look at local economic development and townships within it. Government cannot create jobs. And for some reason, what disappointed me in that speech is there's not a realization that, listen, we actually need to bring all business parties, your NAFCOCs included, and also your hawkers into the understanding of the informal economy. There's still this rhetoric, the belief that, listen, we are this major party, we are the ones that will think about the economy, and then we will give you the directive of society how it goes forward. There's nowhere in the world where government has created jobs. What government does, it creates an enabling environment. It makes sure that its house is in order, and I think it's a bit overambitious, and I think a bit ahistorical still, that the ANC is still stuck in this loop of saying we are going to do it. What we would have liked to have seen, to say, listen, we've spoken to the private sector, we're actually trying to create channels within the informal economy to say, listen, what jobs can we create and how this is going to be done? But for you as a party to say we are going to do it, I think history has borne out that the ANC is not great at creating employment.
So then what you're saying is that great speech, same old, as we've seen before, but the problem is going to be how do you deliver on that, especially that ambitious goal of, raising 1.2 trillion rand in terms of new investment within the next 5 years.
And that's the key one, because the key issue would be that same investment, let's say hypothetically they get it, it goes into infrastructure, if I'm not incorrect, and then if it goes into infrastructure, it's going into municipalities. What is the state of our municipalities? You just have to read what the Auditor General said about just basic people corruption, and I think one where it's still coming up, the issue of ineptitude, where people, it's not that they're corrupt, they just don't know how to spend the money. So what I would like to see is to say, listen, yes, we're going to raise this money, but what we're going to do differently, understanding the situation within our municipalities, national government is actually going to take more of a role to ensure that this money gets through to infrastructure. We see bulk infrastructure come in. And if we don't see that, it basically means it's the same song and dance.
Well, same song and dance, but would you say that when it comes to the issues around factionalism, I know that we've had conversations before prior to this, is that unfortunately the factionalism within the African National Congress is so deliberate, and it's now starting to become so apparent that people cannot even avoid it. We saw that with the last speech that President Jacob Zuma gave before he actually stepped down. So when it comes to the for the factionalism? Do you think that they can deal with some of the internal fighting ahead of the elections? Or are we finding that more political killings, because political killings was another big topic of conversations, are going to be witnessed during this time?
I think that is the key issue, because one thing President Cyril Ramaphosa has done quite well is to actually, in a way, put a blanket on it where we're just saying factionalism, but we're starting to take faces away from it. And the key issue now will be, the ANC works almost like the Conservative Party in the UK. They're all saying, me against my brother against my cousin, but us against the world. And I think that's what they're going to probably do. They're going to coalesce around each other to say, listen, yes, you and I might not get along, but the one thing we do know is that we don't like the DA. Hence, in his finishing speech, he said, are you scared of them? It's a rallying cry. So the key issue is not so much that how much will this factionalism hurt them. Will they be able to get their sides and say, listen, we don't like each other, but the key thing is for yours and my own good, we need to stay together. And I think you're right in saying that's going to be the interesting thing, is can they actually put their act together? And it's very hard at the moment to read how it's going to go. The political killings, as the Minister of, I think Mr. Beki Cele said, there have been arrests, but I think, as you said, it goes deeper than that. The fact that you're being killed for political ideas or basically being political parties is something where...
Well, it's an issue around resourcing, right? It's an issue around, ensuring that you've got some, what is it, the politics of the stomach. And that's where the politics of the stomach always comes into question, as opposed to politics for the betterment of the country. And what we're finding, perhaps, is that the politics of the stomach are still a very critical point when South Africa's 25 years of democracy.
And this is why I said when you actually read the manifesto, it doesn't actually look internally to say, listen, for the last 20 years, we've actually absconded our responsibility in actually looking at the fact that, listen, the types of cadres and followers we're actually bringing into the party are not up to scratch. These are people who view politics as a living rather than politics as serving society.
But wouldn't you say that that is a significant portion of the African National Congress anyways? And that's just coming in from the fact that they are the liberation movement. In other words, those individuals were liberating the country and got into positions or got elected into positions of power. And what background? Where do they go if not the ANC?
Well, as we're finding out, there's little splinter parties you can always join. And it's an issue of saying, and this has always been my critique against the ANC, even before they went into 1994. And I know people say, but you're not even born, but that's not the point. The point is to say, what is the bigger vision the ANC has had post-liberation? The fact that we're 25 years into South Africa and we still call them a liberation movement says to me that you have not done your job. There is no bigger vision of what South Africa means beyond yourselves. And I think that's what they're struggling with. So in the interim of struggling for this bigger vision, you'll go for the simplest things, as you said, which is, listen, I need a salary from this living I'm making. And unfortunately, until they get rid of that understanding and give us a bigger vision for South Africa, you'd always have people who say, listen, politics is just another job. It doesn't mean I have to do my job well. It just means I have to get in. And if it means I have to kill you in the process, so be it.
Yeah, and then obviously a very specific focus on branches now and how the branches need to coalesce and actually get themselves together, because, branches are still having an effect. I want us to talk about the branches, but also I want us to talk about the beginning of the speech where the ANC Youth League does not seem to be a favorite child within the African National Congress.
Oh, how can they be? They're the dysfunctional child. What have they done? For me, I think they tried to host their own election of 2 months or 3 months.
Which got postponed about twice.
Yes, so really the ANC Youth League and its glory has basically subsided. And this speaks to what you said earlier on, the fact that this is an issue of where the internal structures of the ANC were created in such a way that they were serving one person. We won't mention who the person was, but they forgot to serve the bigger, broader public, which is South Africa, and that's why that's been happening.
When it comes to issues around branches, will the branches get themselves together ahead of the elections as well? Because what we're finding with branches is that there's still that issue of ghost members within the branches themselves and people being elected, but they're not even having... When we saw this with the Northwest Conference, where the list was actually supposed to be nominated, where some of the people were even absent.
I think the myth of branches, I think, is really being exposed. When people say the ANC branches are going to do the work, how can they do the work where they themselves have not really been up to scratch? And one only has to look at the last local government elections, where a lot of the branches have said, listen, we're actually not getting direction from leadership. So I don't find that this has changed over the last 3 years. If anything, branches to me, it's an issue of dysfunctionality. It speaks to the issue of where do they actually fit into the bigger things. What you tend to find is that there's a charismatic leader who they now coalesce around, and this charismatic leader, as they've done in the North...
Populism,
as they've done in the Northwest, creates their own branches, and it's actually very detached from the community. The biggest thing, I think, this door-to-door campaign election will show within the ANC is people are going to say, but we don't know you. Where have you been all these years? And I think that's going to be the key struggle. And that's what I think it would have been a greater manifesto to say, listen, internally we've messed up. We have let our branches down. We've let people down. Let's actually fix that rather than go for these great big ideas, which we all know is going to be very hard to do without proper branches.
It's a very critical conversation we're having this evening,
but
thanks a lot.
Though.
But it's a very positive one ahead of the 2019 elections. They've got a political analyst joining us, Kagiso Pooe, who is giving us just a look at that ANC manifesto that took place in Durban.